Tonight, Ben Pearl will speak to us about plovers. Ben started with SFBBO in 2013 and directs SFBBO's Plover and Tern program. He grew up in San Luis Obispo, where he attained an early love for nature, exploring nearby tide pools and oak forests. He completed his Bachelor of Science in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at UC Santa Cruz and first came to SFBBO while beginning his master's at San Jose State University. For his master's thesis, Ben examined how various factors affect plover foraging habitat selection during the winter months in the South San Francisco Bay. His favorite part of field work is seeing plover and tern chicks hatch and grow to become adults, especially when they are banded, and he can track them over the years. He also enjoys sharing knowledge of these special birds through guided bird walks and public presentations. Ben, thank you very much for all the work you do for bird conservation. And I am excited to hear your presentation tonight. Please take it away.
All right, thank you very much, Serena and Stephanie, for the introduction. I'm gonna go ahead and start sharing my screen here. Thank you everyone for joining the Birdie Hour today to learn a bit about our snowy plover research here in the Bay Area. So just a real quick outline. I'm going to go over some of the general ecology of snowy plovers. For some of you, that'll be a review, and I apologize, but I just want to set the table for what we're going to talk about. Next, we'll get into some of the research that we've been doing in recent years, and then lastly, we'll talk about some volunteer events and opportunities to work with SFBBO. So first, Western Snowy Plovers are the bird we're talking about today. Their scientific name is Charadrius nivosus. During the breeding season, males and females can be differentiated by their plumage. So you can see with the male on the left, he's got a dark incomplete breastband, dark crown, as well as dark auricular behind the eye. And then also you can see he's got a rusty cap that'll be present during the early part of the breeding season. Whereas with the female on the right, you can see that she has some of those markings that I just described, but overall they're kind of much lighter in color, more kind of brown rather than a black. And so that's kind of the way that we're able to differentiate between the two. Of course, there's always light males and dark females that make things confusing for all of us working in the field. However, during the non-breeding season, most of those markings fade, or in many of the birds they do. And so a lot of times during the non-breeding season, we can't really tell males and females apart. Now, their habitat extends from southern Washington down through Baja, California. They are found throughout that range pretty much year-round, with the exception of the far northern range. And it's important to note that today we're talking about the Pacific Coast population of snowy plovers. There are also snowy plovers that are found within the interior of the western United States in places like the Great Basin and in some alkali lakes. But today we're going to be talking about the snowy plovers along the Pacific Coast, and those are the birds who are listed. Now, there are some differences range-wide between habitat in most places versus the San Francisco Bay. So most often they're going to be using dune-backed sandy beaches, occasionally river bars, and then also some natural salt pan. Whereas here within the interior of the San Francisco Bay, they're mostly going to be using salt pan habitat. Some of that is natural. A lot of it also is provided by former salt production ponds. And then also they will use both dirt and gravel levees, as well as dry dredge material. Now, typically their nests are 1 to 3 egg clutches, with 3 being the most common. And it's important to note that they really try to blend in with their environment as much as possible. So you can see that the eggs have a cryptic coloration, and snowy plovers will choose areas to nest where their eggs and where they are going to blend into their environment the best. They choose places that have minimal amounts of vegetation, and that allows plovers to see approaching predators and to run and hide at a faraway distance. That way they are not detected and their eggs aren't detected either. Now, snowy plovers like to nest in a variety of different areas on the ground. They lay a simple scrape, but you can see they'll use a lot of different places to do it. So on the left here, we have a footprint that that the snowy plovers laid a nest in, and we do in fact do an event every year called a mud stomp, where we try and create footprints for snowy plovers to nest in. We've also spread oyster shells a lot to provide camouflage and cover for snowy plovers. Not as much for them to lay eggs in, but we always find a couple eggs that are in oyster shells themselves. And then there is some hunting that's allowed in some of these former salt production ponds. And in this case, we have a broken down duck decoy that ended up providing a nice place for plovers to nest in. Now, snowy plovers do have some interesting life history traits. For one, to start out with, the adults do share incubation duties, and they really try to remain cryptic again during this time. So females are the ones who incubate eggs during the day, whereas males are the ones who incubate during night. And probably the most interesting thing about their breeding system is that it's a polyandrous mating system. And so what this means is that once the eggs hatch and the chicks are out, the female is typically going to abandon sometimes before they even hatch, and at most within a few days after. And it's going to be the male who actually raises the chicks. The female will go ahead and start another nest with another mate, assuming that there's enough time left in the breeding season. Meanwhile, the male will hopefully lead the chicks to a safe place to forage and to grow big. Speaking of chicks, they are precocial. What this means is that pretty much from the time that they are born, within a few hours, they are able to walk around and to actually feed themselves. They rely upon the male to brood them, to keep them warm, but otherwise they're pretty independent. Again, they do try and remain very cryptic while they're growing before they can fly. You can see they've got that sort of salt and pepper coloration again that helps them to blend into their environment. And that's really important for them because for the first couple weeks of their life, the main way that they're going to evade predators is by just crouching down and hoping that the predator doesn't see them. At about 2 weeks, they become large enough, fast enough that they're going to run more often. They will eventually try and duck down, but that's kind of when their behavior starts to change. That's also when kind of they start to lose a lot of their down and their feathers really start to grow in. And typically they fledge anywhere from 28 to 33 days. And I've learned, especially this year, that really depends on how much prey they have available. So 28 days they can fledge if they have a lot of prey. If they don't, it can take a few days longer. Now, one thing that's important to understand about snowy plovers in the San Francisco Bay is that historically there wasn't a lot of habitat for snowy plovers. There would have been a small amount of salt pan provided in certain areas, especially within the lower East Bay around Hayward, San Leandro, Union City area, but largely it would have been a lot of tidal marsh habitat. But as some of you may know, during the mid-1800s, after the gold rush, there was a lot of people in the Bay Area, and they were looking for something else to make a living. And what they did is they started diking off tidal marsh and converting it into salt ponds. And so what happened is that around this time, there suddenly became a lot more habitat for snowy plovers. And so what we believe happened is that there were some plovers in the bay, their habitat expanded, and then the population grew with them. Now, there are a lot of reasons for their decline, especially predators, and that includes raptors such as peregrine falcons, which of course have their own issues, but are pretty well recovered, especially in the Bay Area. Includes mammals such as the non-native red fox, which can cause a lot of problems for snowy plovers and other ground nesting species, and especially corvids and particularly common ravens, which are very, very smart birds, very good at detecting patterns, and thus have caused a lot of problems, as you will see later in the talk. Another big issue for snowy plovers in the San Francisco Bay is California gulls. They're a species that nests in similar habitat to snowy plovers and other species that need dry ponds. And they can cause problems because they really like to eat anything. So they'll live off of refuse at dumps, and then they'll also go and eat chicks and eggs of nesting birds. Another major reason for their decline is disturbance. So I mentioned to you that snowy plovers really depend on being cryptic and detecting predators. When a beach is full of people, plovers are just going to end up abandoning that site. And the reason for that is that they are going to view us as predators. And so with how much California has grown over the years, snowy plovers have abandoned over half of their historical breeding sites. Even here in the San Francisco Bay, trails can cause disturbance that can impact snowy plovers, both during the breeding season and during the winter time. And then of course, dogs. Dogs can be a major issue for snowy plovers. Whether it's during the breeding season, they can end up causing males to become separated from their chicks. During the winter time, it can cause issues because snowy plovers are just trying to build up their fat reserves. They spend a lot of energy during the breeding season, kind of using up their energy. And the wintertime is when they're really trying to restore those fat reserves. And so having to constantly fly away can really have a major impact on them. And then it can even cause direct mortality, as we can see in the bottom right picture. Habitat loss, of course, is also a major concern, whether it be invasive plants. And on coastal sandy beaches, that's often European beach grass. This has a few different impacts. For one, it's going to actually change the way that dunes form. It's going to make them steeper, and thus it's going to reduce the ability of plovers to detect incoming predators. As you can see, it also just kind of chokes up the whole habitat. So it's going to make it so that there's less area for plovers to nest. Of course, in the San Francisco Bay, we don't have dunes within the interior. We have salt pan, but the problem that we have is with especially with crystalline ice plant. And what this does is, as you can see, forms a really dense carpet. Because it's a bright red, if snowy plovers do still nest among it, it actually makes them stand out and reduces their cryptic nature and allows predators to more easily detect them. Aside from that, it's also important to think about climate change. So sea level rise is kind of estimate of maybe 1 to 2 meters by the year 2100, and I'm sure there's probably some variation among that, but it's pretty comparable to what we see during king tides each year. And so this picture here I have is of the Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk during one of those king tides. And for those of you who've been there, you can see that normally it's a really wide beach, but during a king tide, there's almost no habitat left. And that's unfortunately what we may be looking at for snowy plovers as climate change proceeds. And it's not quite the same issue, but within the San Francisco Bay, where plovers are using these former salt ponds, higher water levels is going to impact our ability to manage water levels within those ponds and still provide them with habitat. So for all of these reasons, snowy plovers have been listed as federally threatened under the Endangered Species Act since 1993. Within various states, they also are protected. So here in California, they're a species of special concern because the bulk of their population is found here. And in Oregon and Washington, they're listed as threatened. Now, they are protected throughout the year. So that means during the breeding season, when there's posted fenced off areas that you need to stay out of those areas and give them space. But it also means during the wintertime at places such as Crown Beach, which somebody had mentioned during the chat. It's a place that snowy plovers are known to overwinter at. It also means that they need to be given space and allowed to roost. So just want to give you a real quick idea of how many snowy plovers there are out there. You can see this graph. This is based on annual surveys during May conducted across the range. You can see that overall there's been kind of an upward trend in the population. The most recent year of published data in 2018, there's about 2,400 adults. And the range-wide recovery is 3,000 birds across that entire range. So really not a whole lot of birds, but we're about 80% of the way there. And from what I understand, I don't think the numbers have changed too drastically since that point. Now, in order to facilitate recovery, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service broke up the entire range into 6 different recovery units. Now, we are in Recovery Unit 3. And don't pay attention to what exactly it says or what it looks like because there's a little bit of inaccuracy. But basically, Recovery Unit 3 is going to include the 9 counties of the San Francisco Bay Area on the interior side, with the exception of San Francisco. So it covers quite a wide area and in a lot of different places. Most of them are found within the South San Francisco Bay, and that's where we conduct most of our work at places including Hayward Regional Shoreline, Eden Landing Ecological Reserve, as well as multiple parts of Don Everett San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge. Now, they are also found in the North Bay at a few random sites, a few sites, so I'll quickly go over those. We have the Napa-Sonoma Marshes Wildlife Area. We have the Hamilton Wetlands and Belmarin Keys. And then we also have the Montezuma Wetlands. But today, my talk is going to focus on our work in the South Bay. So just a real quick idea of what we do. We go out, we collect our data. This means that we're going out and we're looking for plovers at a particular site, and we're trying to find all of them, record their location, and potentially identify nests. And this is what a nesting snowy plover looks like. This is a female because females are the ones incubating during the day. You can see that her back end is kind of pushed up a little bit, and if we were to sit and watch her for a bit, we'd see her occasionally stand up, move around, and settle back down on the eggs. And that's how we'd know that there's a nest to go out there and find. When that is the case, we actually go out, we find and float the eggs. And this helps us to estimate the hatch, when the eggs are going to hatch, and to determine the fate. For instance, if we go out and float the eggs and determine that they've just been laid, and a week later the eggs are gone, we know that it's not possible for the nest to have hatched and that it must have been depredated. This is pretty helpful in a lot of different situations. It's also really helpful when we want to color band. And color banding is an important way that we're able to track the survival of snowy plovers and determine their movements and migrations across the range. When we do want to band them, we catch them at the nest. Each chick gets a unique 4-color combination, with the left leg being recovery unit specific. So appropriately, snowy plovers in the San Francisco Bay, one of our unique combinations is black over orange for the San Francisco Giants. All right, now this quick video just to share with you so you can see a little bit about what it looks like when we band snowy plovers, and what you'll see is that the male is trying to lure us away with calls and with distractions. All right. So we do also occasionally want to color band adults. Obviously, we're not able to trap adults by hand because they can fly away. So instead, what we do is we use a type of trap called a Noose Map. And what this is, as you can see, is a strip of mesh wire with a bunch of nylon loops tied to it. We place those sometimes around the nest. Sometimes if we're banding, we'll place them in specific patterns depending upon how the adult is moving around. And then hopefully the adult will run across, the leg will get trapped, and then we can go ahead and band them. This is also really important because it helps us, again, to track movement of adults and their survival and to better understand how they're using habitat. Here on the right, this picture is actually one of my favorite birds. It's black over orange and green over yellow. I don't know if any of you can guess why, but I'll just go ahead and show you. It's who I like to affectionately call the Bay Area baseball bird. And in fact, I just saw this bird this morning. He was originally banded at the Ravenswood Ponds in Menlo Park. He's often been seen over at Eden Landing and Hayward. I know that he winters at Ocean Beach in San Francisco, but for the past few months this year and last year, he's been hanging out in Crittenden Marsh in Mountain View. So I think this kind of tells the story of how much information this banding can really provide for us. Another example of what color banding can do is to kind of tell us about use of habitat, especially natal site fidelity. So in 2018 at Crittenden Marsh, we banded 3 chicks, one of which was black over aqua and aqua over green. It was confirmed fledged that year. In 2019, we found that he was a male and that he established a nest within 100 meters of his natal nest site, which was pretty cool. We were able to band 3 of his chicks. In fact, Serena had helped me that day. One of them did survive to fledge, although unfortunately I don't believe I've seen it since. In 2020, he again established a nest right nearby his natal nest site, just 130 meters away. His chicks hatched, but they evaded me a little bit, so they weren't able to be banded, but one of them did fledge. And then this year again, he did establish a nest nearby, but unfortunately, I believe that nest was depredated before those chicks could hatch. Now during the winter, our population actually grows. It's larger than during the breeding season because we get all the birds coming from the interior of the population, those birds that I mentioned that are not listed. But either way, what you can see is that over time, the number of snowy plovers in the San Francisco Bay has increased. Don't have our data up there from the past couple of years, but it's pretty similar, around 350 to 400 the past couple of years, which is really great that we're supporting more snowy plovers during the winter time. Of course, as I mentioned, during the breeding season, we have less plovers because the birds from the interior have moved back to their breeding sites there, and then all of the migrants from elsewhere have also gone back to their breeding sites. But again, you can see that over time, our population has increased. When we first began monitoring snowy plovers, there was only 72 supported within the salt ponds. Part of that was as the management changed over from salt production to wildlife management. There just wasn't as much habitat. Looking at this data, what you can see though is in 2010 was actually the peak of our snowy plover population thus far when we counted 275. But I am happy to report that despite some of the kind of ups and downs that we've seen, this past year was actually our second highest population count of 263 adults. It is, of course, important to remember, though, that the goal for the San Francisco Bay for that Recovery Unit 3 is 500 adults. So we're a little bit over halfway to there, but we definitely have a lot of work to do in order to meet those recovery goals. So I know part of my talk is called, changing landscape. So now we're getting to that part specifically. And I had mentioned to you guys that, historically, there wasn't a lot of habitat in the bay for snowy plovers. So here you can see historical representation of what the South Bay looked like. It was just a massive network of tidal marsh. You can see that currently this is what the South Bay looks like. As I mentioned, a lot of those that tidal marsh was converted to salt production ponds, and then a lot of it also was filled in. So places even like through the middle of downtown Redwood City, that was tidal marsh. Places like Foster City was tidal marsh. About half of San Francisco was tidal marsh. So a lot of changes have gone in the San Francisco Bay. But in any case, as far as these salt ponds, over time, there were various different owners of the land. Eventually, they all came under the ownership of Cargill, and it was, I think, in the early 2000s they realized that they really didn't need all of that land to produce the salt that they wanted to produce. And so in 2003, they sold a vast amount of these lands to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and with that, the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project was born. So just a real quick background on this project. The goal of it is to restore 15,000 acres of salt pond habitat. It is, in fact, the largest tidal marsh restoration project on the West Coast. And basically, the goal is to open up these former salt production ponds to tidal action and allow vegetation grow and return to marsh. The project is 18 years in, but it's still got a lot to go. It's potentially going to be 50 years and maybe even more. So there are going to be a lot of impacts as part of the restoration project. What it's going to do is it's going to increase tidal marsh habitat, and that will support tidal marsh dependent species such as the federally endangered Ridgway's rail and salt marsh harvest mouse. It will increase environmental health because tidal marshes can actually clean the water and make it a healthier environment. It'll provide resiliency to climate change because tidal marshes actually will act like a sponge. And of course, as part of it, public access is greatly increased with the extension and eventual completion of the San Francisco Bay Trail. Of course, these are all great things that we're all happy about. There are, of course, some impacts to other species that currently use these habitats because it's going to decrease the amount of dry pond breeding habitat, both for snowy plovers, for other species like federally endangered California least terns, as well as American avocets and black-necked stilts that really rely upon these habitats for breeding. The San Francisco Bay is also one of the largest, I think even the largest estuary on the Pacific coast in North America, and it supports hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of migratory shorebirds and waterfowl, and often they do rely upon these salt ponds during high tides. So it could have unfortunately, some negative impacts on all of these species. So in order to combat that, one of the things that we try to do is to maximize the remaining habitat that's left that's going to be managed as dry ponds. So a great example of that is Eden Landing, where we spread over 20 hectares of oyster shell to improve the habitat. The goal is to create some high quality, dense habitat that would help to maximize the camouflage and cover of breeding snowy plovers and other species. Now here's a close-up picture of a female incubating a nest among the oyster shells. And you back it out, you can see that finding a snowy plover incubating a nest among these giant shell plots can be quite a challenge for us. And the hope, of course, was that it would be also a challenge for snowy plover predators as well. So real quick here, you can see that since we spread these oyster shells in 2015, there's been quite a lot of nesting within these ponds. The area to the north, where it's kind of open water, there's still a little bit of nesting, but largely the majority of snowy plover breeding in this area shifted to where the oyster shells were. So we're going to take a quick look here, go through year by year and see how it turned out for snowy plovers. So you can see in the first year, or the year before the enhancement, we had 54 nests on the pond in E14. Our hatch rate was pretty low at only 33%. We like to see about 50% or above. So what you can see the first couple years, We attracted a lot of snowy plovers to nest within these ponds, within this pond. We had 98 nests the first year, and our hatch rate was 60%, which was really, really great. So the first year was really good. Second year, we again attracted a lot of birds to nest, but you can see actually things kind of turned around. We had really, really poor hatching success that year. The reason for that, of course, was predators. In 2015, especially towards the end of the season, we started to see predators really keying in on this kind of high density source of prey. So we had peregrine falcons that were nesting nearby, and this was actually a nest that we thought had hatched based upon the evidence when we came to check it out. But we had a nest camera on there, and as it turns out, these peregrine falcons had in fact taken these freshly hatched chicks straight out of the nest. In 2016, common ravens were really one of the main issues. We had 88 nests in E14. Unfortunately, 60 of them were eaten by predators. Camera traps recorded 30 of those depredation events, and as it turns out, every single one of those events was common ravens. So common ravens, again, very, very smart animals. They were able to recognize that there was a high density prey resource there, and they were able to exploit it, unfortunately. So 2017, least tern showed up, started breeding at E14. And I'm not going to talk too much about least terns today, but it's important to note that least terns can be helpful to snowy plovers because they form a colony and they'll actually defend their colony against predators. So they can, once they form a large enough colony, they can effectively chase off common ravens, sometimes harriers. Peregrine falcons can still be a problem, and they will get depredated by them. But there's a lot of evidence in other areas that snowy plovers benefit from least terns. So we were pretty excited when least terns started nesting here. Thought maybe they'll be best friends forever. Okay, so maybe not quite. They have their little squabbles, but of course snowy plovers will do the same amongst each other. But overall, they do get along pretty well, and we're again really excited to have them nesting nearby each other. So 2017, the first year least terns arrived. They were really successful. You can see they formed a nice dense colony on the east side of one of our shell plots. Of the 21 nests that we monitored, at least 13 of them hatched, and they produced a lot of fledglings. So 20 to 28, which is really great. Definitely meeting some of their own recovery goals. And this is important because in 2017, it was kind of more of the same of what we saw in 2016. Very few of the nests were hatching. Most of them were being depredated. After terns arrived, we had a much higher hatch rate. And interestingly, what we found is that snowy plover nests that were closer to the tern colony fared better. And so any nests that were within 100 meters of the colony had a 94% hatch rate. And it certainly appeared that snowy plovers were selecting for nesting nearby the tern colony. All right, so after 2017, we're feeling pretty encouraged. You can see that our hatch rate went up to 51%, averaged out over the year. So we're hoping that 2018 and beyond would be great years for snowy plovers and for least terns. Unfortunately, though, things have not gone so well for least terns since that point. You can see that 2018, 2019, we had a lot of least terns show up and nest, but very, very few nests hatched, and very few fledglings were produced from those colonies, as you can see over here. And so the least tern colony struggled. And as a result, unfortunately, snowy plovers also struggled as well. And especially this past year, 2021, was kind of the worst year since those oyster shells were spread. You can see that the number of snowy plovers nesting in E14 went way down. 35 nests were monitored this year in E14. And again, really, really poor hatch rate and a high depredation rate of those nests. And then I have another metric to share with you in terms of our banding and our chick fledgling success. It's important to note that we have a not a huge sample size, and so they're kind of got to view this with some caution. But I think the general trend here still holds. So if you look at kind of the first couple of years of the oyster shell enhancement, 2015, 2016, 2017, things were looking good for E14. Snowy plover chicks were faring better compared to the rest of Eden Landing and other areas within the recovery unit. Unfortunately, what we've seen over time is as predators have really keyed in, snowy plover chicks have had kind of worse and worse fledgling success. And at this point, E14 had a pretty poor year for chick fledging, and other areas of the recovery unit fared better. The reason for this, of course, is again predators. 2018, we had red foxes that were documented on camera eating a lot of snowy plover nests, and by extension, a lot of least-tern nests as well. In 2019, we had California gulls that were an issue on some of the nesting islands nearby. We also had a lot of issues with harriers, with white-tailed kites, and then this really interesting situation where we had these kind of these weird tracks that were leading to all of these depredated snowy plover and least-tern nests. We were thinking it was a snake. Nobody could really quite figure out what was going on. It turned out, in fact, that it was a skunk with a really, really muddy tail, as you can see in that picture in the top right. Its tail probably got muddy walking through the marsh and then picked up mud. And basically it was dragging its tail while it walked around and ate all of the eggs and chicks. 2020, we had coyotes, we had common ravens again. Harriers were a major, major issue. During our surveys at E14, I think we averaged over one harrier per survey. So they were very, very consistently hunting on the pond, and we observed them eating snowy plover eggs and taking snowy plover and least-tern chicks. And then this past year, we again had issues with common ravens. They were documented on camera eating a number of nests. Peregrine falcons were on site frequently. Coyotes were a problem. And then at the beginning of the breeding season, this bottom left picture of this harrier and herring gull was just kind of an unusual thing that I hadn't seen before. You'll have to forgive the photo quality is digoscope from a few hundred meters away. But we had this harrier that had taken I think it was a duck. It was a northern, I think it was a shoveler. But in any case, this harrier was eating, but there was a herring gull that was kind of staying right nearby and was just trying to get little scraps. And it's not really something that I'm used to seeing. It was just definitely sort of an interesting sighting. So moving on, I've got a positive story to share now. So in 2020, we were able to rescue an injured snowy plover from Eden Landing. On May 4th, our biologist, Jessica Gonzalez, observed an adult male with a broken wing in Eden Landing Pond E6. And you can see this picture that its right wing is kind of sagging. She was able to capture it and drive it up to International Bird Rescue in Fairfield. They performed surgery to pin the wing, and it was successful. And initially, they were hopeful that that would be able to be released. Unfortunately, in the end, as it turned out, its muscles didn't heal properly, and it was determined to be unreleasable. And so, July 15 of that year, it was transferred down to Monterey Bay Aquarium, and it's now the Plover ambassador there, as you can see in this picture on the right. And so, if you go on the Monterey Bay Aquarium website and look at their shorebird cam, you will see who Jessica affectionately calls Charles on that camera. So moving across the bay, I'm gonna talk a little bit now about some of our work at the Ravenswood complex at Don Edwards National Wildlife Refuge. Specifically, I'm going to talk about ponds R3 and R4. So ponds R3 and R4 are some of the more important ponds outside of Eden Landing. This year, we monitored 24 nests within these ponds. Our hatch rate was 66%, which is really good for us. As I mentioned, we want to see over 50%. We were able to band a lot of chicks. We banded 27 chicks. So far, we've only determined that 33% fledged, but I can tell you that in the past few weeks, we've been able to find a number of those fledged chicks, and I think we're going to keep finding a few more. Interestingly, most of them are up at Eden Landing at this point. And we also did see a high apparent unbanded chick survival, and I think when all the numbers shake out, this is going to be one of the most successful breeding sites in the San Francisco Bay in 2021. Here we have a picture of some of these chicks that we banded. I'm hoping to find these ones. I don't think we've confirmed them fledged just yet. But we have another story of a rescue at R4 this year. So abandoned nests are something that happens each year. We're not always sure why. Sometimes it's due to disturbance, or maybe one of the male or female is depredated by predators. Never exactly clear why. We had 2 at R4 this year. One of them, the eggs were not viable. But we had a second one that I had observed it. We had been monitoring it through the weeks. I had noticed that it had cracks, and so it was in process of hatching. I hadn't seen an adult that day, but because it was in process of hatching, I just assumed that maybe the bird was off. However, a few days later, I came to check on it first thing in the morning, because I assumed that they'd be getting close to hatch, and I wanted to catch them before they got away. However, first thing in the morning, the eggs were cold. And this is when I started to really get worried. because at that point I knew that the eggs had in fact been abandoned. At that point, I wasn't able to do anything because there were several other broods nearby. But the next week I was planning to collect the eggs. So a few days later I came back. Lo and behold, there was still no adult there, but the eggs were still alive. And I knew that because I could hear the chicks tapping inside the egg. I could hear them peeping, in fact. And so what I did is we collected those eggs. We brought them to Ohlone Wildlife Rehab Center across the bay in Newark. They kept them warm for us overnight. And then the next day, one of our biologists drove them up to International Bird Rescue again. Now, International Bird Rescue did an amazing job, and I encourage you to check out their blog and learn about how they're able to get the eggs to hatch and to help these chicks raise. But you can see over time how they grew, starting out just as little chicks. In the middle picture, they've got the awkward teenager phase, kind of moving along pretty close to fledge, and then the picture in the bottom middle was the day that we went up and collected them. I put color bands on them, and then we released them at Eden Landing. So I'm going to show you that release video now. It is very, very choppy, and so I apologize for that, but I'd still like to show it to you, and hopefully you all enjoy it. Back up here so you can see them testing their wings a little bit more, and then we'll move on. All right, I apologize for that. All right, so another positive story here. So now we're going to move on and get back to some of our research. Next up, I want to share some of what we did over at the Hayward Regional Shoreline the past couple years. This is located just north of Highway 92, next to Hayward, of course. There are 3 different sites there. There's Frank Stump West, there's Oliver Brothers North ponds. These are 2 areas that we monitor, and then the Leastern Island that's monitored by East Bay Regional Parks District. So Frank Stump West, it's an interesting place because it's an area that we kind of always knew could potentially support snowy plovers. Occasionally, some chicks would be reported there, but we never really had the time to monitor it because we were busy with our other sites. But in 2020, due to the pandemic, we weren't able to survey some of our sites in Don Edwards, and so we had extra time, and it turned out pretty well for us because 2020 was a really, really busy year for snowy plovers at Frank Stump, partially because we were able to monitor it. We knew that plovers were there. We were able to help direct management of the pond as well. But what we found is that there were 18 nests that we monitored. 83% of them hatched, which means only 2 of them were depredated. We only color banded 5 of them, but 3 of them did survive to fledge. And you can see one of them, black over aqua and red over green, was later observed wintering at Ocean Beach in San Francisco. We had very high apparent survival of those unbanded chicks. And in fact, this ended up being pretty much the most successful plover breeding site in 2020. So it was really fortuitous that we were able to monitor snowy plovers there, since it was a rough year for snowy plovers elsewhere. Now, 2021, we again monitored at Frank Stump, and we were expecting things to go well again. A lot of plovers showed up. Unfortunately, things were kind of the exact opposite. We monitored 13 nests, only 15% of them hatched. So that's in fact 2 nests hatched. We color banded 2 of them. That's just from 1 nest. And I'm happy to report as of this morning that one of those chicks was confirmed as fledged. Unfortunately, the other chick, it doesn't appear, made it. We suspect that ravens were the main predator of most of those nests on the pond. We had observed them hunting on the pond frequently. Unfortunately, there wasn't much to be done about that. So after being one of the most successful sites in 2020, Frank Stump was one of the least successful breeding sites in 2021. So this kind of highlights how variable things can be from year to year, and how it's really important that we provide habitat for plovers in numerous areas in order to support them. And here's actually a picture of these chicks that were banded this year. I'm not sure which one of those survived to fledge, actually. All right, the other site at Hayward Shoreline is the Oliver Brothers North Ponds. These are actually some of the original salt production ponds in the bay, along with some other ponds at Eden Landing. In 2020, we monitored 11 nests. Half of those nests hatched, but what we found is that there was pretty poor apparent chick survival. We realized that definitely this area has some potential to support breeding plovers, but it has a lot of remnant salt production infrastructure. It's also close to power towers, and so it's not ideal, but it still can be a productive place for snowy plovers with proper enhancement. You can see, as I mentioned, snowy plovers will pick some interesting places for nests. In this case, they picked a nice place with a little bit of shade. So we were back again in 2021 to monitor there. We found 11 nests, similar hatch rate, 45%. This year we banded 8 chicks. Unfortunately, so far, it looks like none of them have fledged. We're still hopeful. We're conducting a lot of band resighting with large flocks. We're hoping that we're going to find them, but it's not looking so good so far. So these are some of the chicks that we had banded out there. We had an interesting situation where this male was just really, really close. A lot of times the male or the female will be kind of far off while we're banding, and we'll kind of stay away until we are finished. This male was really close even when we were kind of finished banding and about to leave. So what you can see from this past couple of years is this is another site that has potential. Snowy plovers come there every year, but it really does need some enhancement, some TLC in order to be a productive place for snowy plovers. All right, and then kind of the last place I want to quickly mention here is Patterson Pond. This is another interesting situation. This is an area that in the late 90s and early 2000s, when the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was conducting the bulk of snowy plover monitoring, this was actually one of the busier ponds for snowy plovers in the bay. There wasn't a ton of habitat available elsewhere, and so this provided a lot of habitat. However, when SFBBO took over monitoring in 2003, we didn't find any plovers there in 2003 through 2005, and eventually it sort of just dropped off our radar as a place for breeding snowy plovers. We kind of started checking back up on again in recent years. Last year, one of our volunteers had mentioned that she had seen some snowy plover chicks out there, so we were excited, and we went back to doing weekly surveys there this year. And for reference, this is located just beyond Coyote Hills along Alameda Creek. You can see here that we monitored a lot of nests out here. There was 19 nests that we found. It's the first time there's been breeding activity confirmed and documented by us since I think 2002. A lot of them hatched. We banded a fair number of chicks. Unfortunately, though, what we found is that they really didn't do very well out there. There's a lot of predators, whether it be harriers, ravens. There's a large colony of nesting gulls nearby. So my assessment of this pond is that it has some potential, but again, as with some of these other places, it needs some enhancement to help provide cover for both adults and chicks. But it certainly is a place that I think should be managed for snowy plovers in the future in order to support their recovery as well. And then lastly, I just wanted to share some pictures of here. This is actually one of the chicks that I believe did fledge. We were able to band these chicks, but interestingly, you can see we had this snowy plover nest that was laid. Actually, this is kind of some salt right here. Looking real close, you start to look at the picture on the right. You can see maybe there's something kind of weird going on there, and then when you kind of zoom in close, you can see that one of these chicks that had hatched was in fact hiding in a salt cave. So kind of a unique place. And luckily, our biologist was able to find it and band it. All right. So real quickly, I want to mention some of our events coming up. We've got the California Fall Challenge, big bird photo, big day. And as Stephanie had mentioned, this basically this is your chance to go out and photograph as many birds as possible. Our goal is 150, but I think we can do better than that. And that's going to be coming up on September 18th. If you're interested, you can go to our website and sign up for that. And then I also want to give a quick plug. We've got a snowy plover and least tern habitat enhancement event coming up October 2nd, Saturday from 9 to 1 p.m. That's going to be at Pond E14 in Eden Landing. What we're going to be doing is removing more predator perches, improving the foraging habitat by kind of helping create more places for water to flow, and then also spreading oyster shells. And this is hopefully going to improve snowy plover habitat as well as least tern breeding habitat. If you're interested, feel free to email me to learn more about it or visit our website. Of course, I have to acknowledge all of the work that went into this from our SFBBO field team, both staff and volunteers, all of our partners, Don Edwards at CDFW, East Bay Parks, Mid-Penn, NASA Ames, the Alameda Flood Control District, the wonderful folks at both International Bird Rescue and Ohlone Wildlife Rehab who are helping us to rescue these birds, and of course, all of our various funders who help us to continue this important work. So with that, thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ben. It's really great to hear about all these updates with the plovers. So we do have some questions already in the chat, so I'll just get right to them. So Ben, the first question is, for E14, why do you think there was such a significant decrease in the number of nests in 2021?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think I can potentially get back to this just so you can see here, 2021 we had 35, and so I think what you can see here is there was kind of pretty steady, and then it kind of a decline last year, and then it kind of continued. I think a lot of that stems from just the amount of predation pressure. There's just continuously, like I mentioned, 2020 there was one harrier and one peregrine falcon on site every single time, so they're just getting hit really hard. Hatching success wasn't good, fledging success wasn't good. Eventually, snowy plovers are gonna move on, especially if their nests don't hatch at a site. They're gonna try and find other places to nest. So I think they're moving on to Hayward Shoreline. They're moving on to Patterson. I think a lot of them actually did also move over to Ravenswood. We saw a shift this year during the breeding window survey. In fact, where the week prior we had maybe 120 plovers at Eden Landing, and then during the actual window survey, that number dropped in half. So I didn't mention it, but this is, in fact, this year was one of the lower counts at Eden Landing, whereas at Ravenswood, that number dipped up. So I think it's essentially, it comes down to predation pressure really being the main issue.
Cool. And related to predation, Ronnie K asked, are you considering studying an area with no oyster shells to prevent keying in of areas on or of predators on the shells? This won't work for ground predators, but maybe it'll work for aerial predators.
Yeah, so the majority of snowy plover habitat does not have oyster shells. So we have one main area where there's a ton of oyster shell spread, as well as some smaller oyster shell plots that we had previously spread. But what we're actually looking at right now is working on grant proposals and projects to enhance other areas of Eden Landing, to try and attract some plovers to those sites, and actually kind of, in the end, what we want to have is have less intensive use of any of these sites. What we've seen is that when snowy plovers nest in high density, they're more prone to predation. So if we can enhance more areas, provide higher quality habitat overall, we're going to spread out plover breeding among those areas, and that's going to, in the end, that's going to keep predators from really focusing in on one area and having such a major impact.
Thanks. And then another question is, do you know if there are equivalent groups or studies like ours at SFBBO and IBR for piping plovers on the East Coast?
Yes, most definitely. I can tell you when I did my master's thesis, I read a lot of piping plover research, whether it be from the Great Plains along the Missouri River, but also especially along the Atlantic coast. And then actually during our range-wide meetings each year, I think it was back in 2020, before the pandemic hit, we had the Fish and Wildlife Piping Plover Recovery Lead come and give a talk to us and share some of their insights, because they are very similar species. And so we do like to share notes and kind of learn about what we're doing with each species.
Nice, thanks. And then Jamie asked, after predation events, did you notice birds re-nesting under objects more often? We've seen that in Santa Barbara County. Would it be feasible to add objects birds can nest under to some of your sites?
Yes, Jamie, we do. We definitely see that. Whether it be under, remnant boards, there's a few boards like old salt production infrastructure that we've seen snowy plovers kind of nest under a number of times. Some of those I've tried to remove because we don't want predators perching on them. But what we found instead is because we have a lot of pickleweed, we have plovers that end up nesting underneath pickleweed, which can work out pretty well sometimes. But I would probably be a little bit hesitant to place objects specifically just because I'd worry about predators perching on them. But yeah, it is definitely something that we've noticed. So I'm glad you have as well, Jamie.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And then Ronnie asked, is there any consideration of taking eggs for hatching at IBR to help bring the numbers of snowy plovers up? Once their numbers are high enough, egg collection and assistance could be scaled back or stopped. And it seems like it would take a long time to get their numbers stable otherwise.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think that's something that U.S. Fish and Wildlife would have to be the one to initiate that. And I don't think that's something that they would want to do unless the species was critically endangered. Even with lease turns, when they were down to just a few hundred breeding pairs, I don't think that's something that they turn to. I think that's sort of considered a last resort of collecting eggs and kind of rearing them in captivity, because I think that potentially presents a host of other problems. So while we are really appreciative of IBR and other organizations being able to help raise them, I think our best bet is to try and give them as good a habitat as possible and hope they can take it from there.
Yeah. And Marie noted that the 18th is also California Coastal Cleanup Day. Yes. So if anyone is going out to participate in that, we hope you'll also snap some photos of birds around the bay and submit them to our Bird Photo Big Day. And then another question we have is, you've referred to a couple of times to inland snowy plovers. Can you clarify what regions those are?
Yeah. So basically, Western Snowy Plovers are going to be found anywhere from the interior, like the Central Valley. Historically, there would have been a fair number of plovers breeding in the Central Valley, but there's really not much water left there. But really, the largest populations of snowy plovers in the interior are found at Mono Lake, a little bit at Owens Lake, but really the largest population is at the Great Salt Lake. There are thousands of breeding snowy plovers at the Great Salt Lake, and then they're going to be found elsewhere in kind of the interior west at alkali lakes in places like southern Colorado, parts of New Mexico, Oklahoma, West Texas, places like that. And the ones that are found west of the Rockies, those are all going to winter, pretty much all of them are going to winter on the Pacific coast, mostly in Southern California, but we've seen a couple of them from Utah out here in the San Francisco Bay.
Cool. Ronald asked, are there snowy plovers in the ponds by the Dumbarton Bridge, so pond SF2?
There certainly are. So I talked mostly about R3 and R4. Those have supported more snowy plovers in recent years, but SF2 does have some breeding snowy plovers. This year, there wasn't a ton. We only found one nest. We banded it, and unfortunately, we never saw those chicks again. But SF2 has had some big years in the past. That back area is managed for them specifically. And so we have had some years with 15 to 20 nests out there, decent hatching success, decent fledgling success. It is definitely prone to predation because there's so many power towers, so many kind of electrical poles right nearby. So ravens and harriers, peregrine falcons all can be an issue out there too.
Nice. And it is almost 6 p.m. right now. So if there are people who need to hop off, thank you so much for joining us. But we do have a couple of more questions, so we can finish up with those first, if you're okay with that, Ben.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to point out, I forgot to point it out. I wore my Snowy Plover shirt today. I forgot to point that out to everyone. We do a different shirt every year for the CFC, and so our year was back in 2016.
Yeah, and the slide we had earlier actually shows our design with the 40 birds on it. So we hope you'll check that out on our website. It's pretty cool. Okay, so going on to those last couple of questions before we sign off. So let's see, we have, okay, Ronnie K says, will SFBBO be involved in snowy plover work at Tunitas Creek Beach when they develop that site?
That's a great question. So Tunitas Creek, that's being restored by San Mateo County Parks. And that's in a different recovery unit. That's in recovery unit 4. And so that's going to be probably some consultation with Point Blue Conservation Science. I know I've been in meetings to talk with them about that during their kind of end of season meetings. So that's going to be more Point Blue and San Mateo County Parks.
Good to know. And then Marie says, is there anything that can be done to help plovers at Ocean Beach? It seems like there's a problem with dogs running off leash. Yeah, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah. So I can tell you that, San Francisco and Ocean Beach probably historically would have been really, really great habitat for snowy plovers. But there's just too many people there. There's too many people. There's too many off-leash dogs. You really would need to really be able to cordon off and keep a large area just completely free of people. And unfortunately, for the most part, that's just not possible. So I don't think there's been any nesting on Ocean Beach for quite some time. But yeah, I mean, it would be great because there's nesting there, or there's roosting flocks there right now. As I mentioned, some of our birds do winter there every year. So maybe in the future, that's something that could happen. But as of right now, I don't really see that.
Yeah, and Yvonne had a related question about, the need for improved signage and enforcement at beaches. Do you know of any efforts to address that?
Yeah, there's definitely a ton of work being done on that. And certainly in areas where there's more beach breeding habitat, that's certainly something there's a lot of focus on that. And Jamie, who had a question real quick, she works down in Santa Barbara County with plovers, could definitely speak more to that. But yeah, a lot of areas, they have docents who are on site, who are kind of educating people. Not as much of an issue because people aren't allowed to walk in the salt ponds anyways. So we do have some disturbance. Sometimes people trespass. We had some guy for the past couple of years riding his motorcycle in the middle of some ponds. But other than that, we're fortunate in that sense that we don't have to deal with that level of disturbance. I think instead, because we have few people around, we have a lot of predators. We have large amounts of tidal marsh, and that means lots of harriers. We have large peregrine populations. So I think that's kind of more what we have to contend with in terms of kind of disturbances to plovers.
Yeah, as Jamie says, it definitely varies a lot by site. So the last question I'm seeing in the chat right now is from Tom and Diane, and they're asking if there were any plovers at Warm Springs this year.
There were. Warm Springs is it's an interesting site because historically, kind of in the 90s and early 2000s, there was a lot of breeding plovers out there. It's kind of gradually has slowed down to some degree as other areas have been more managed. But I think we monitored maybe like 4 or 5 nests out there, and then we saw maybe 3 or 4 broods from undetected nests. And I didn't talk about that. We try our best to find every single nest like it's Pokemon or something, but they're really good at hiding. So there's always some nests that go undetected. We find them as chicks, and so we were able to band I think 2 broods from undetected nests. Haven't confirmed that they fledged, but hopefully some of them made it. That's really the work that we're doing now, is to try and find those banded fledges in the large post-breeding flocks.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the update. And thank you again, everybody, for tuning in. We really appreciate you being here and caring about our local snowy plovers. Ben, is there anything else that you want to share with everybody before we sign off?
No, I just want to say thank you to everybody for coming out today. Of course, be mindful of snowy plovers and other, wildlife, whether you're at the beach or in the bay near the ponds. There's a lot of wildlife that you often don't even know is there. I know a lot of people probably have been around plovers and you didn't even realize it because they're so good at hiding. So just keep that in mind and, support them where you can.
All right, thank you so much, Ben, and thank you again, everybody. I hope you have a great rest of your evening and will join us for some of our upcoming California Fall Challenge events. We have lots of field trips and other talks, so we hope to see you there. Thanks again. Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.